And we continue with our program this afternoon. And as you could see in the program, it's going to be a presentation from ILGA. And it's Cianán who's going to speak to you from ILGA Europe. And he's going to speak on a report that has as a focus trans rights are human rights. The focus is how one can create a more inclusive feminist movement by dismantling anti-trans narratives with arguments and facts, and bringing the reality into the debate. So Cianán works on intersex rights, education, health, trans rights, and the anti-gender backlash in Europe and Central Asia. As well, he's monitoring and is engaged with the Council of Europe and the United Nations in United Nations institutions. They started as LGBTI activists in the US in 1996, and they have previously worked with the Indiana Transgender Rights Advocacy Alliance and the Asia Pacific Transgender Network and Transgender Europe. So Cianán, you are very welcome to our conference.
Thanks very much for the introduction. As was said, my name is Cianán Russell. I am a senior policy officer at ILGA Europe, the European region of the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association. And today I'm going to be talking about the division regarding trans inclusion in feminist movements and in women's rights spaces, and some of the methods that we've been looking into to address this problem over recent years in our work at ILGA Europe. I have a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen, and I'll ask you again if it's working, just to make sure that you can see what I want you to see. Is it working?
Could you please speak a little bit more slowly?
Of course I can. Yes, thank you. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So where do we start in this conversation about anti-trans narratives? I think the important place to start is a bit of recent history, a bit of a snapshot of what's been happening in Europe. There are a wide variety of manifestations of anti-trans actors on the continent. These range from the arguments about prisons in the United Kingdom to the cessation of providing transition-related healthcare to youth in Sweden at Karolinska Hospital, to the statements by Carmen Calvo, who is the previous Minister for Equality in Spain, saying that legal gender recognition based on self-determination was legally insecure, to arguments from individual women's rights or LGBT rights activists and organizations, such as the recent growth in online prevalence of the LGB Alliance and its supposed chapters in different countries around Europe. All of these things are the visible part of a broader concerted effort. And I don't even think that broader concerted effort is one that is ultimately really interested in trans people. But it's much more about the anti-democratic, capitalist, authoritarian efforts by the anti-gender movement actors, as well as those sort of in oligarchical positions, to centralize power and to scapegoat minorities to try to do that power centralization. And we see the way that these movements manifest in different countries being highly localized and contextualized. And that's why the trans issue, even as it comes up in different countries around the continent, appears in different ways. It appears with respect to legal gender recognition in Spain, with respect to children and their access to transition-related healthcare and social transition in Sweden. It appears with respect to single-sex spaces in the United Kingdom, and it appears in the context of sort of protection, supposedly, of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people from coercive transition in a more diffuse way. All of these manifestations are about the hook that will work in that context in that moment, and shows us a bit about the functioning of anti-gender and anti-trans movements in that they're highly adaptive. And I imagine you've had this conversation already today and will continue to have it, that these movements look for hot button issues in local contexts and manipulate those issues to try to sway people further away from the sort of human rights-based lens on interacting with the state, on the state's role in society, on interacting with their fellow citizens, etc. I'm going to spend the bulk of this presentation talking about some of the arguments that these actors make, but I'd like to speak first about strategy a bit. And what I want to say about this first and foremost is that the vast majority of anti-trans arguments are not good faith arguments. They're posed as questions that are not intended to be answered. And we'll see specific examples of this as I go through the presentation today. But the question itself is the target, not the answer to the question. And there's very little actual engagement in conversation about the question to try to find a solution that works for all parties. The purpose of raising the question is to stop processes or derail processes, not to find solutions. And so one of the pieces of strategy in dealing with anti-trans actors is to point this out and come to conversations about the questions that are being raised in a solution-oriented frame of mind, because that frequently helps to push those questions, to clarify that those questions aren't about real concerns so much as they are about stopping processes. And unveiling that can be an effective tactic. Another piece about the strategy for dealing with anti-trans actors is that trans people are frequently positioned by the opposition as having a biased perspective in the discussion of our own human rights. And so it's really vital that non-trans people engage in these discussions from an educated point of view and are able to point to myths and misconceptions, are able to respond to them or to clarify what the real issues are in conversations, both in public and in private, because the insidiousness of anti-gender and anti-trans movements means that a lot of the work that they do affects private perceptions that our family members, our friends, our colleagues hold, and that their target is to sway those people to change their voting and to change their engagement with the democratic process in ways that uses trans people as a lever. And the only way to sort of protect that piece is to engage those conversations with our friends and family. And trans people are in a really precarious position in engaging those conversations. One, because many of the arguments that are posed present us as violent or potentially violent, as perpetrators, as delusional or mentally ill, and don't allow us to realize our humanity. And just the debate around these questions can be very harmful. And we've seen that particularly in the United Kingdom in the last couple of years, with the very public anti-trans media narrative, meaning that many trans people are seeking to leave the UK at this point. The trans movement is burnt out, and that reality is a reality in part because frequently trans people are positioned as the only people who will speak in favor of their own rights, and that is an exhausting process when you're positioned against an opposition that wants to see your rights curtailed not against an opponent who feels that your rights are in competition, but someone who actively wants to see you as an individual have fewer human rights. That's a really difficult place to be in. And so there's a strong need for non-trans allies, for cis allies, to engage in these conversations. And the final piece about strategy is about engaging specifically with the media, because media narratives are very frequently across the continent hyperbolic, misrepresent the reality, and reinforce anti-trans narratives. The media in Europe is not trans-friendly in an across-the-board sense. And so you will frequently see, for example, headlines claiming that a clinic that treats trans children is offering child sex change, which is a falsity. Children under the age of 16 or 18, depending on the legal circumstance, can't access surgeries at all, let alone having them promoted by these clinics. In fact, trans children are likely only getting access to therapeutic support and potentially to reversible hormonal treatments. And the media plays a crucial role in spinning false narratives and creating public panic about the fear that our children may be turned trans. And another piece around that fear that's important to point out is that an underlying piece of the moral panic is a belief, perhaps not conscious belief, but a belief that being trans is a bad outcome, that trans people's lives cannot be fulfilling, whole, cannot have love, cannot have employment, cannot have success, that a trans life is inherently a worse life than a cisgender life. The moral panic only works when you can assume that the thing that people are transitioning to do is worse or bad. But trans people who've had supportive networks around them, have been able to access the medical care that they need, are very frequently much happier having transitioned and much more successful in their life, because the piece that was making them miserable has been corrected, and they've been able to figure out what they want to do with their lives, what kind of employment they want, to find love. There's a very widespread fear, in particular among the parents of trans children, that their kids will never find relationships. It's very, very widespread. My mother had it and has had many conversations with other parents of trans people about how I did in fact find love, how I have been very loved in my adult life, but that fear is pervasive, because there is this underlying transphobia and underlying belief that a trans life is a bad life. Okay, so I want to dive a bit into some of the arguments that anti-trans actors make, and then I will spend a bit of time with each of them talking about the reality and how to respond to these arguments. And then there will be a bit of time for us to discuss, or you to ask questions at the end of this segment. So the first one that I want to talk about is the argument that the purpose of gender ideology is to promote the rights of trans people against everyone else. So this argument started to a degree with the Vatican, or became more public from the Vatican in their 2018 paper, Male and Female, He Created Them, which was a sort of educational guidelines document. And the assertion there in that document, as well as in subsequent pieces, both from the Vatican and others, was that the purpose of this sort of pro-gender movement is to elevate this minority, this ill minority, into higher rights than everyone else. However, first off, the concept of gender ideology is an empty signifier. It's not actually a thing. There isn't a gender ideology movement. There's an anti-gender ideology movement that's created a ghost to fight against. And they use this phrase to mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. But all of those things are pro-autonomy, pro-human rights, pro-bodily integrity, and pro-democracy things that they use this phrase to attempt to combat and to malign. And so it's important to call that out, that those who are in a pro-human rights position don't have an ideology, but in fact are founding their work in the human rights framework and attempting to interpret and apply that framework in a way that is non-discriminatory and covers everyone universally. And as a result, the trans movement is really seeking to ensure that everyone has equal access to human rights, that everyone has access to the right to recognition before the law as themselves with identity documents that function for them to live their daily lives. Not that just trans people have that access, but that everyone has it. And at the moment, non-trans people have that access in a very simple way, and trans people have a much more complicated pathway or no pathway at all. And so it's about equality in that case. It's about equal access to healthcare, having healthcare that meets your physical and psychological needs, about having equal access to employment without being afraid of or experiencing discrimination, and having discrimination that you experience be adjudicated by the appropriate bodies in your legal context, so by equality bodies, for example. Another piece of this concept of gender ideology is that the target really isn't about protecting anyone's rights. They frame the argument as saying that gender ideology is supplanting existing rights of some people. But when you look at the arguments that they make, they're not pro-rights arguments. They're not pro the rights of cisgender people or pro the rights of women or pro the rights of children. They are anti the rights of trans people. And so the framework that they use is not an affirmative pro-rights frame, but in fact an anti-rights frame in the discussion. And so this phrase that gender ideology actors are opposed to the rights of everyone else is actually a mirror on the individuals who are saying it. That their advocacy and arguments are rarely, if ever, pro-rights. And the LGB Alliance is a great example of this. Their advocacy is almost exclusively advocacy against the human rights of trans people, but very rarely is it actually about the needs or rights of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, because their target isn't to promote the rights of those who they claim are being attacked, but indeed to attack the rights of trans people specifically. A couple other pieces of this are that there is an inherent argument in the statement that gender ideology is about trans rights that links the concepts of sex and gender to one another or attempts to decouple them. There is historically in feminist movements been a great deal of discussion about the role of biological determinism in protecting the rights of women and in sort of engaging in feminist discourse. Do our bodies determine our futures? Should our bodies determine our futures and our access to the variety of resources and opportunities that humans have? And many components of the feminist movement have argued firmly against biological determinism. But when we see anti-trans actors speaking about sex and about the sort of direction that individuals should go based on their bodies at birth, it's inherently biologically determinist, which puts it at odds with a great deal of feminist work, of literature, and thinking over the last half century. The second frame that is frequently present that I want to talk about is that trans discussions are erasing women or weakening the fight for equality for women. First off, I think it's important to say that the trans movement is interested in gender equality, in seeing that all people of all genders have equal access to opportunity and resources. The target has never been for trans people to have more access, more protection. Part of what trans movements and trans people are fighting against, though, is a really hostile society and a really hostile legal infrastructure, which means that more intervention is necessary to reach equality, not that there is a target of having sort of superiority of trans people, but indeed that infrastructure is necessary to address systemic exclusion and systemic oppression that trans people experience. And accessing legal gender recognition on the basis of self-determination doesn't actually mean an erasure of the reality of women or of their rights. It means that trans people are able to be accurately categorized into the legal system that exists. Self-determination at its core is about bodily and physical autonomy and bodily and physical integrity, that you as an individual should be able to make decisions about your own body without the interference of the state or of any other third party. That fundamental argument is the same argument used in pro-abortion and pro-choice movements, that as an individual, a person who is pregnant should be able to make the decision about whether they carry that pregnancy to term based on their own decision, their own body, and without the intervention of the state or of other practitioners to impede those decisions. And when you look at it that way, you see that the underlying framework of pro-abortion or pro-choice movements and trans rights movements is the same, that an individual should be able to make their own decisions, particularly as an adult, about their own bodies, and that the state's interference in that hinders the human rights of everyone, not just of the person involved, but of everyone, because it undermines the right to autonomy, the right to physical integrity. And once it's undermined once, it's much easier to undermine in other contexts as well. The third example I want to talk about is that you may hear from anti-trans movements something that sounds like concepts of gender, gender identity, or gender expression are removing or harming the concept of sex as a ground of protection for women's rights. Firstly, trans movements, LGBTI movements do not argue that sex should be removed from lists of protected grounds. They argue that gender, gender identity, and gender expression should be added to those lists of protected grounds because they are distinct. The gender identity of an individual, so the way that they think of and perceive themselves, and the gender expression, how you reveal your gender to other people, so hair, makeup, facial hair, nail polish, are both pieces that cause people to be subjected to discrimination and to violence. And the target of the trans rights movement is to ensure that all of those potential causes of harm, of discrimination, violence, harassment, etc., are treated as grounds on which someone should be protected. But removal of sex from that list is not an argument made by trans movements. It's an argument that anti-trans movements say trans movements make, but it's a lie. And so there's a necessity to call that lie out. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge that everyone, cis or trans, has a gender identity and a gender expression. We, unfortunately, as a society in sort of an English-speaking context, have conflated the concepts of gender and gender identity in a way that individuals frequently say, my gender is male, female, non-binary, when what they mean is my gender identity is male, female, non-binary, because gender is a societal macro level construct. And we as individuals don't have a societal macro level construct. We have a positioning within that construct. And so the sort of expansion of these list of terms is about clarity. Perhaps an individual is being discriminated against based on that macro level structural concept, or perhaps that discrimination is about their perception of themselves. And being able to disaggregate that discrimination both allows us to deal with individual cases in a more effective way and to create infrastructure that addresses structural problems and structural exclusion. The next example I want to talk about is that this is a very common argument that collecting data based on people's self-determined gender identity undermines statistics and data collection, for example, with respect to violence against women or equal opportunity in the workplace. Firstly, population estimates for trans people put trans folks at around 1% of the population, a bit more, a bit less. We're still really working on clarifying exactly what that number looks like, but it's quite small. And the statistical impact of that number is when looking at violence and when looking at employment statistics, frequently not statistically significant. So we're not talking about massive shifts in the ability to do statistics on groups on populations. However, the piece that is more cogent on this issue is that when trans women are exposed to violence, but they get counted based on their identity documents as men, that actually undermines our understanding of how violence against women manifests. When they are perceived as women and attacked because they are perceived as women, or because they are perceived as women and then someone finds out that they are trans, that is an instance of violence against a woman. And so long as it is counted outside of that framework by our state or by the monitoring institutions, the scope of the problem of violence against women is actually underestimated. And thus the services that come from that and funding for those services is underestimated as well. And so the ultimate reality is that allowing people to self-identify and to position themselves in statistical data collection accurately marginally improves the efficacy of that statistics. The other piece of this argument that I think is really important is that when it comes to statistics about equality, in the modern era, the only equality data point that is not based on self-identification is sex. You mark your own race based on the collection of questions. The state doesn't determine or adjudicate your racial categorization. You mark your own religion based on your own perception of yourself, and the state doesn't have oversight over what your religion is or which box you need to tick when saying that you've been exposed to discrimination or violence. You mark your own disability status, and that's disaggregated from whether you are officially recognized as having a disability, because the state system isn't actually superimposed on the discrimination or violence collection mechanisms. But when it comes to information about collection of discrimination and violence on gender, the state has authority to tell you which box you fit into. And there's a question about why that should be the case. Why treat gender as a distinct type of ground for exposure to violence and discrimination, when all of the rest of them are about how we perceive ourselves or about how others perceive us. The state doesn't actually check how you perceive yourself or how others perceive you in making this distinction on gender, nor does it check when you mark yourself as having a particular religion, race, or disability status, for example. So there's a discontinuity between this particular piece of statistics and all the rest of equality statistics that states collect and monitor in Europe. Next, I want to talk a little bit about this argument, which is that men will abuse women's quotas by pretending to be trans. This is also an extremely common argument. The first piece of response to this argument is that fraud is a crime and is independently a crime. Similar to my stabbing someone with a knife is a crime. I make this analogy because I could go to the grocery store and buy a knife for any purpose. I don't need to assert what that purpose is. Nobody is overseeing that to make sure that I'm not going to stab someone with it. And creating a legal framework that essentially coerces people into proving that they're not going to commit a crime to be able to access something that anyone else can access, something that they need to be able to live their life. I need to chop my onions, for example. Creating a legal framework that requires them to prove they're not going to do something bad is counter to most of the way that the system of laws across the European continent works, with a very few number of exceptions. Guns, for example. Identity documents are not frequently used for the purpose of committing crime. They're used to interact with everyday life. And the vast majority of people who apply for identity documents do so that they can get a job, so they can get access to the bus or to an airplane or what have you. And creating an additional hurdle for a specific group of people because someone might commit a crime is not the way that we generally create laws. It's an argument to try to create panic and make people think that that potential for crime is much, much larger than it is. In fact, there are very, very few cases of the use of identity documents to commit fraud within the context of legal gender recognition. There have been self-determination-based legal gender recognition laws for the past 10 years, and there is one case in one country of a man committing or seeking legal gender recognition for the purpose of committing fraud. A single case over 10 years. And creating a legal framework that seeks to prevent 1 out of tens of thousands of cases at the expense of all of those other tens of thousands is inherently discriminatory and a violation of the responsibilities of the state to protect the human rights of its citizens. I think I've got one more myth, and then I think we're sort of at the end. The last argument, I think, is children are too young to know their gender identity, and respecting their gender identity creates confusion, whereas contradicting them helps them to understand who they are. Firstly, it's important to see this argument as one that is only talking about trans children, and looking at that argument as one that only actually discusses trans children helps to sort of pull it apart. The assertion is not that a 3 or 4-year-old girl who was born with a vulva and a uterus and identifies as a girl doesn't know who she is. In fact, I would posit that everyone assumes that a 3 or 4-year-old who was born with a vulva and a uterus and asserts that she is a girl accepts that that 3 or 4-year-old knows who she is and is able to tell you her identity. The question only comes in when the body of the individual and their gender identity at a young age do not match. And having that pushback focused only on trans children links back to the point I was making earlier about the underlying arguments that anti-trans movement makes, which is that being trans is bad. It's inherently bad, and thus, if an individual identifies with their sex assigned at birth, fine, good, no challenge. But if a child identifies with a different gender, then that's a bad thing, and it represents a mental disease or an illness or a problem in the child's rearing, and the child should be punished for that. And let's make no mistake. Refusing to call a child by the pronouns and name that they identify with is violence and is a punishment that results in massive increases in suicidality and self-harm among trans children. The current medical literature indicates that just one adult recognizing the gender identity of a trans child decreases their likelihood of suicidal ideation by half. And having an accepting family decreases their likelihood of suicidal ideation by 80%. So refusing to recognize the gender identity of a child, or even the exploration of a gender identity of a child, is a form of violence inflicted on that child to try to make that child comply or conform with the expectations that are based on their body. Those expectations that are based on their body, again, are biological determinism. Yeah, so these were the arguments I wanted to present you with today, and I kind of wanted to just give us a bit of space for conversation if you had anything, or I can kind of make some other comments. If not, I'll turn off the screen sharing so we can just chat, and you can let me know what you're thinking.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And we can take questions from the chat here as well, and then I will read it out. And does anyone in the room have a question to ask?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for unpacking all those myths for us. My name is Maria. We met in Brussels in, I think it was November. Yes, so good to see you again. I don't know if you can see me. I was just thinking that all these myths, they belong in a context. If you can sort of just talk a bit on how they are being used in the EU level, because I know you work towards the member of the European Parliament. What kind of feedback you get from different kind of groups within the EU. I'm also thinking, since of the invasion of Ukraine and the money flow coming from the ILGA acts, if you could say something around that as well, that could be quite interesting, I think. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for the questions. Yeah, so the EU structural question is really interesting. I think I'm going to respond to that with a couple of specific examples. For example, at the beginning of the current Commission's mandate, they made clear that they would create an equality strategy focused on gender. And there was a great deal of discussion about whether that equality strategy would be an equality strategy that was about equality between women and men or about gender equality. There are two camps in this conversation, and some of those camps included perhaps surprising bedfellows. On one side, the sort of pro-gender equality side, we see many Western European countries, LGBTI rights movements, of course, some components of the women's rights movements, arguing that gender as a framework is more inclusive, more adequately fits with the type of equality that the European Union is seeking, and that gender as a concept is inherent to understand and to incorporate into the legal framework to be able to address the kinds of discrimination and social exclusion that women face. On the other side were the more far-right governments, authoritarian governments in the EU or pseudo-authoritarian, as well as some women's rights organizations arguing that the word women was necessary, but also that gender as a concept was one that was not agreed on in a legal framework across the EU, and that there was that gender was something that specific nations didn't recognize or didn't agree with as a construct, and thus there can't be a gender equality strategy. I think it's particularly interesting that authoritarian governments and some women's rights organizations found themselves on the same side of this discussion. And from my point of view, there are two really important things to keep in mind here. One of them is the strategic decisions we make about who we are willing to cut loose to promote our own human rights. We've seen this repeatedly over the last 60 years since the civil rights movement. One very clear and specific example that maybe people are aware of is the development of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act in the US in the late 1990s, where the Employment Non-Discrimination Act was supposed to be on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, so to protect all LGBT people. There was political pushback against the entirety of the act, and so the leading LGBT rights organization said, we're just going to do sexual orientation for now. We'll come back for trans people later. And that decision to stop fighting for everyone and only fight for what could be won in the moment against an oppressive anti-rights opposition resulted in an Employment Non-Discrimination Act for 20 years that didn't protect trans people on the grounds of gender identity. And we see that same tactic happening frequently in pro-rights movements, where the pro-rights actors are convinced that if they just don't fight too hard for this marginal group, that maybe they'll be able to advance the rights of this much larger sort of middle group. And that was what was happening around the name of this strategy, is we may not get a strategy at all if we say we want gender, so let's just accept equality between women and men, even though it really harms LGBTI people, non-binary people. And that kind of political decision is one that I feel we need to reckon with as pro-rights movements, when and how we decide that we're going to cut the margins off to save the majority, or to save the more privileged or the more centralized groups of this minority that we're trying to protect. The other piece was about money. First off, there's not a ton of research into specifically money flows on anti-trans actors. There's a bit, but not a ton. But the one thing that I think is a clear fiscal link that's been well documented is between an organization called WOLF in the US, which is a lesbian rights organization, and the Heritage Foundation, which is an anti-LGBTI, anti-abortion organization in the US. They partnered financially together to work against gender identity and legal gender recognition, gender identity protections and legal gender recognition laws, and that's been well documented. But this is actually a call to put back to many of you in the audience today as academics, that this is a gap in the literature. There's a growing body of literature looking at the funding flows for the anti-gender movement in general, for anti-LGBTI actors, or for anti-abortion actors, but looking specifically at anti-trans actors, the money flows are still a bit murky. And it's not necessarily the role of civil society to be trying to dig that information out. We're not as well positioned frequently as academics are. So that's a bit of a call to action for you.
Thank you. We also have some questions from the chat, so I will just read them out to the room so that everyone is on the same page. Gea asks if there's any way to even argue with these people that are against the rights of trans people, because people that use these arguments seem to have a very difficult time to change the narrative that they create. And just to build on that, when we posted our event, like, we're a small organization and we normally don't get critical comments, but it happened in our small organization in a small country, and we invited them to come along and listen, and it didn't seem like that was what was wanted from that side of the argument.
Yeah, this is a really good point, and you're right. They are captured, and so the strategy that we frequently use in our work is to work on those who are not yet captured, and to try to change the media narrative. And there's a window, right, between when someone is exposed to anti-rights arguments and when they really get sucked all the way into them and are essentially a lost cause on that thinking. And that's a place where all of us, cis and trans, need to be proactive in making sure that everyone around us both knows our positions and understands why we hold those positions. And that means taking individual risk. Trans people are kind of constantly in this position of having to take this individual risk because the people around us either know that we're trans or are interacting with us in a way that may harm us unintentionally because they don't know that we're trans. But a lot of cis people aren't required to engage in that. And I think it's necessary to be brave as cis allies and engage with those hard conversations over the dinner table with our the bigoted uncle or whatever the trope is, and try to push back. And it may not be that you'll change the uncle's mind, but maybe your cousin who has been listening to that uncle is able to hear a different point of view. This is ultimately a question very frequently of humanizing the discussion, because many times the people who make anti-trans arguments fall into two groups. One group, they don't know any trans people, or they don't know that they know trans people, so it's not a human experience for them. Or two, someone close to them transitioned and they're unhappy about it. There's really only these two groups. There aren't anti-trans actors who love and care for their trans friends, because this is not a way to love and care for an individual. And so the people who don't know anybody are the ones that are the most mobile, and being present in their lives to say, well, I know trans people, And those trans people aren't violent or scary or crazy. They just want to live their lives. They want to get jobs. They want to have a house. They want to have a family. And they don't want anything to do with all of this stuff that they're being accused of. That's, of course, a much more time and labor intensive strategy than a media campaign, but it's the way that's likely going to work in the long run.
I have one more question here at the Zoom, but if anyone in the room wants to ask a question too, we can, or should I just go ahead with it? Yeah, okay. So Katarina wants to know that the anti-gender ideology movement often use right-based arguments in their rhetoric. They use the concept of family rights, for example. How can we expose and challenge this hijacking, in citation marks, of human rights language?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you're very right. It's a manipulation of the framework that many people in the general public, but even many policymakers don't recognize as a manipulation of the framework. There are a couple of pieces, and none of them are quick fixes. I wish that I was able to say, here's the quick answer, but it's not there. One of them is about the need for societal education on what human rights are and how the human rights framework works. For example, the argument that one of the arguments that was part of my presentation that's very, very common is that these two sets of rights, the rights of women and the rights of trans people, are in opposition to each other and creating, like, if trans people get rights, women lose rights. That's not actually how the framework works. And there are very clear mechanisms in the International Human Rights Framework for adjudicating situations when there are true conflicts of individual rights to make the decision about which of those rights should win. But the true conflict of rights is an extremely rare situation. It's not actually something that happens on a day-to-day basis for every individual. And there's been a lot of work in the framework to address the conflicts that do arise. And so it's important to point out that that those misconceptions are indeed misconceptions, and try to clarify that information. But it's also necessary for us as sort of pro-rights movements to be really careful not to fall into the same kinds of traps that the anti-rights movements are using. So, for example, when we say that there is a sorry, I've lost a good example. When we say, okay, if I were to say that legal gender recognition is a human right, that's actually false. There's not a human right that says legal gender recognition is a human right. The human right is right to recognition before the law. And I need to form my arguments actually based in the framework and not kind of make up human rights because it's easier to say or catchier as a slogan, because the opposition does that all the time. They say family rights or human rights. All parents have the right to decide how their child will be educated, or the father of a fetus has the right to protect his offspring or what have you before that fetus is born. Those rights creation is something we need to stop doing as a pro-rights movement, because we muddy the framework as much as they do by trying to find easy slogans. And that means that we need to have more nuanced conversations. It also means that we need to figure out how to get the media to be willing to have more nuanced conversations. Because the way that media and social media work, it's much easier to get your slogan, which is 5 or 10 words, picked up than it is to get your 300-word explanation picked up. But that doesn't mean that people aren't interested in 300-word explanations or 3,000-word explanations. It just means they're being fed 5 and 10-word slogans, and that's what's inundating them in their daily lives. And so finding ways to ensure that those longer, more nuanced pieces get into the discourse is part of what's necessary for us to address this hijacking piece.
Thank you. Just need to turn my mic on. Yeah. Thank you. Any... Hör du? Hör du nu? Känns bättre. Any more questions from the audience here in the room? No.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me? You don't
No,
hear
not
me?
well.
Maybe you can come closer.
What close now?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is a question. I would like if you could tell me a little bit more about your movement, the ILGA, ILGA Europe. Could you tell me a little bit what about your organization?
Sure, of course.
Okay.
ILGA Europe is a European regional network of LGBTI groups and organizations in Europe and Central Asia. We have about 650 member organizations in 54 countries, from Iceland to Russia and Central Asia, including down to Turkey. So the WHO's definition of Europe. And we work primarily on three different themes. One of them is movement building, meaning that we do capacity building of different LGBTI organizations in the region, as well as host an annual conference. Hopefully again this year we'll be able to have an annual in-person conference again, and work to build up the infrastructure necessary for a thriving LGBTI movement in the region. The second piece that we do is regranting. So we work with major donors to make small, accessible grants for small organizations. Frequently NGOs working on LGBTI rights need 5, 10, 20,000 euro grants, and big donors don't make grants that small. So we act as sort of an interlocutor. And what we also do is help to make it so that those small organizations and initiatives can meet the reporting needs of big donors. So we sort of are the go-between to make sure that the money gets into the hands of LGBTI activists on the grounds and on the ground and in the grassroots. And the final thing that we work on is policy advocacy at the European level and supporting national advocacy. So we work in the Council of Europe, based in Strasbourg, as well as in the European Union, in all of the sort of organs of the European Union, and a little bit with OSCE as well, to work to advance policy and law that protects the human rights of everyone, including LGBTI people, on the grounds of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression and sex characteristics. And we also support advocacy efforts of our members in the different countries that we work in by either connecting them with other members who have had successful advocacy around the issue, by supporting their advocacy through the use of our own name and contacts with institutions and with governments, or by helping to research legal advocacy pathways towards achieving the human rights for all. And we also are engaged in a good deal of strategic litigation at the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice on LGBTI related cases. So we have 22 staff based in Brussels. Maybe that's also useful to say.
Thank you again. Thank you again. Any more questions from the audience here or from the chat as well? Yes, here in the chat. Do you use feminism as a vision in your work? Could you say a bit about the collaboration between feminist groups and your organization?
Yes, absolutely. To the first part of the question, I think that a feminist framework is a core of our work. We're interested in seeing the ways that structural and systemic oppression impact the variety of people we work with and for, as part of our thinking on the way that we make our decisions. And that shows up in the mechanism of all of those sort of columns of work that I talked about. For example, with our regranting mechanism, our role is to make it so that more marginalized groups are able to access resources that they may not be able to access in the systems that don't have the infrastructure built for them. And we have targeted specific women's organizations, as well as trans and BIPOC organizations as part of our funding calls and strategy. And we work very hard to make sure that the systemic exclusion that those groups experience doesn't mean that they can't access the resources that we may be able to offer. And so try to build their capacity and support them to access those resources. We also work very closely with many feminist organizations in Brussels and beyond. That collaboration means frequently a lot of cooperative learning, where we're learning about specific issues that are important to feminist and women's rights organizations, and they're learning about issues that are important to us. And there's collective strategy around how to approach those issues. So as a concrete example, we do a lot of work to try to combat early surgeries on intersex infants and children, otherwise known as intersex genital mutilation. And our strategy from the beginning of this work has been to work closely with those organizations working on FGM, on female genital mutilation, to align our thinking and make sure that the advocacy that we are doing isn't harming their advocacy or their targets, and the advocacy that they're doing isn't harming ours. So there's a very close strategy collaboration, as well as work to do collective campaigning and collective communications work on this issue, so that there's ultimately the target being that no one is subjected to unwanted surgical interventions without their individual personal consent, and maintaining the focus on specific groups that are at higher risk of those kinds of interventions. I'm not really sure if that totally answers the question, but I'll go ahead and so.
I think so, thank you. And I think we had to make that our last question, if you are satisfied with that as well. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Kino. And I'm sure that we'll keep in touch and work more. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.